Welcome to another episode of the Esoteric Lounge podcast. I'm your host, Dan Crisafulli. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the concept of the Bardo, taken from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The Bardo is a Tibetan Buddhist idea or outlook on what happens during the process of death and dying. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, as it's known here in the West, or as it's known in the East as the Great Book of Natural Liberation through Understanding in the Between, or just simply the Bardo Thodol, is the reference for all who wish to learn more about how Tibetan Buddhists understand the subtle life forces that dictate all of which we see and experience here on Earth, as well as those that carry us into other dimensions of meaning. The between, in this case, refers to the period between the end of your current life and the beginning of your next. This doesn't necessarily mean that your next life would be here on Earth. As we will talk about, there are many different ways in which the force of energies and experiences which comprise all of what you are right now may move between incarnations. When we ask ourselves what death is here in the West, it's often answered with a scientific explanation. Something about a heart ceasing to beat or a brain ceasing to produce waves. This is what we have come to understand about the experience of death. It's sterile, haunting, anxiety-inducing, and is the end-all be-all that culminates a life of experiences. Its finality breeds fear. We must understand that there are countless cases of a person flatlining and coming back, and more often than not, reporting intense subjective experiences. In the popular imagination developed by a modern scientific education, death is most often supposed to be a terminal state, a nothingness, an oblivion, a void that destroys life, that swallows it up forever. It's aligned with sleep, darkness, and unconsciousness. It's feared by those who feel happy or feel they should be happy, and it's sought after by those who are in misery, filled with unbearable pain and anguish, as a blessed final anesthesia. But what if we all took the time to analyze this nothingness? Would we find something within it? Could a thing be present within no thing, or nothing? Is a place called nothingness truly nothing at all? If it is an area of nothingness, then it cannot be nothing. Area is a definitive place, defined by coordinates and boundaries. Nothing cannot have an inside or an outside. If a line is crossed into nothingness, then by definition, it's not nothing. The line alludes to a boundary, of which nothing cannot have. As nothing, it cannot have an effect. It cannot have energy. It cannot be a thing, a realm, a state, or anything. It is absolutely nothing to fear. It's also nothing to hope for. When we imagine death as an entry into nothing, we are merely comforting ourselves, likening it to a place equivalent to that of deep sleep, a place where no effort needs to be exerted and no thinking be required. The material view of sleep, coupled with the fact that for most of us, deep sleep is not remembered and barely experienced at all, is the best analogy that we have to the idea of death. It's the easiest to accept and the most effortless to understand. But what is life if not the pursuit of the greatest things that could be understood? As we will discover in this episode, one of the most interesting takes on death and dying comes to us from the high mountains of Tibet, around 14,000 feet above sea level. The people of Tibet have been practicing their own sect of Buddhism for thousands of years. There are people who revere death and treat life as if it were totally in preparation for death and what comes afterward. Now, I'm not a Buddhist in the general sense of the term. I don't practice Buddhism. But I appreciate what these people have cultivated in terms of a lifelong practice devoted to deity. It's an important part of our life, I think, to have a belief in something greater than yourself. A force, a being, or just a simple understanding that there may be a divine reason or purpose for all of this. The very fact of holding a belief in one of these gives way to the desire to be a better person, for yourself and for everyone around you. It helps you see that everything is in fact connected, and that everyone is connected as well. You get a bit lighter on your feet, a bit freer in your thoughts, and a bit more invested in your pursuits. It's an enriching notion. It brings meaning to life. The Bardo, or between, is a period of 49 days after death, where the person who has died is tested in numerous ways by deities that are merely conceptualized here on earth as strange bodies with different attributes corresponding to the qualities that make up the psyche of the deceased, as it corresponds to the realms we encounter after death. As with anything, and as Hermes Trismegistus said in his great work The Kybalion, all is mind. And this is no different. The deceased is challenged by what Tibetan Buddhists term as sounds louder than 1,000 thunderclaps and lights brighter than the brightest light known to man. In the Bardo and its many layers, a person is shown what could only be termed as a sensory overload of sights and sounds. It's bewildering, frightening, but can be avoided through understanding and assistance. Of course, they have no real sense organs as we think of them in the material sense, which alludes to the fact that all of what is experienced in the between is in the mind, but is no less frightening as if it were in our material world. It kind of makes you think a little about how just real this material world that we live in really is. The idea that all is mind permeates anything, regardless of where you find yourself in life or death. Things that seem real, frightening, or even have a sense of permanence to them are often ideas constructed in your mind that have tricked you into thinking they're real. When a loved one is sick and death is close, the family of this person would call upon a Lama, which means spiritual teacher in Tibetan, and represents a highly honored profession. The Lama is the middleman between a person and a practice and performance, a person and the practice and performance of Tantra. The best English equivalent of Lama would be a mentor. It's important to know what Tantra is as well, and why a Lama would be so revered within the Buddhist community, they being the link to the practical study and use of Tantra. Simply put, yet not so simple in itself, Tantra concerns itself with the rebuilding of the extraordinary realm of enlightenment by the energies of wisdom, after the demolition of the ordinary world of suffering. The Lama stays with the newly deceased person, who is often wrapped up and kept in the home with his loved ones for a period of time after death, but before decomposition. The loved ones are encouraged to leave the room, while the Lama stays by the deceased's side. It's believed that the cries and weeping of the family members can be heard by the deceased and will bewilder and confuse them as they enter one of the most challenging times as a newly dead person. It's important to describe what the process of dying is to the Buddhists. In their own understanding, and translated directly from the Bardo Thodol, death is a point of freedom when the subtle mind or soul of a person loses connection with the embodiment of that life. It is perhaps beyond consciousness, though ordinary people transit it unconsciously, never noticing at all the period between life and death. As there are many parallels between deep sleep and death, try to think of the last time you were consciously aware of the process of falling asleep. There's a good chance you've never been fully aware of it. Continuing on with what death is, it is understood as a pure negation, a perfect zero, a timeless moment, a widthless boundary, and is aligned with absolute reality, with the body of truth, with the ultimate clear light. A Buddha, an enlightened being, is thus one whose death is her infinite body of ultimate reality, her concrete permanent resting place, which nevertheless not only never obstructs her relative experience of the interconnected realm of beings, but makes it indivisible from freedom and openness, and therefore perfectly blissful. Needless to say, such a being is no longer afraid of death. The deceased, with the Lama at their side, are encouraged to go forward consciously through each realm of the between, and to travel with conviction and understanding of what exactly is happening. To know that they are dead, and it is up to them to become conscious and aware of that fact, and to gain liberation through understanding that. By the way, the Lama is reading passages that have been extracted from the Bardo Thodol and whispering them into the ear of the deceased, or reciting them aloud in the room. It is understood that the deceased can still hear what is happening around the body of their former incarnation, and that these excerpts help to reinforce a certain courage that is needed to navigate the between. In essence, the Lama is instructing the subtle energies once trapped in the gross form of the human body. These subtle mind energies are what perceives the between as they move from one lost life to the promise of another, whether it be earthly or not. Concerning the idea of karma, or the collection of actions that cause development and change, the karma of a person actively in the between is more fluid than it regularly would be, and decisions made in the between can have a stronger effect than those made in the human form. It's important to heed the instruction of the Lama and not succumb to confusion and terror while navigating the between. Buddhists have schematized the possible life realms into 6 main categories. Each of these are possible destinations for a person to reincarnate based on their karma, and like I mentioned before, are more than likely heavily determined by choices in the between. These 6 realms ascend from worst to most divine and are as follows: hell beings, pretons, animals, humans, anti-gods, and gods. Accumulated ignorance is the driving factor behind an incarnation into the lower realms, or as we observe them from this human realm, anything from animals and below. Accumulated ignorance or spiritual laziness, or any term that you feel is necessary, would be the catalyst to a less than desirable incarnation. This is why Buddhists are devout meditators and spiritual practitioners. Their sojourn in the Bardo is something taken very seriously, something that could potentially deliver them to an enlightened existence. Through devout meditation and a highly disciplined life, Buddhists are able to prepare their minds and bodies for that inevitable moment of death that may come at any time. Many of their waking hours are used for prayer or meditation. If we notice anything about animals, it is that they are driven by instinctual processes and typically operate based on survival. This is why the human realm is considered as such a precious treasure, a hard-won, magnificent achievement, not to be wasted carelessly. Relatively speaking, human life has a freedom from the necessity of involuntary drivenness by instinctive reactions, and the ability to use that freedom with intelligence and sensitivity to attain ultimate freedom and reliable happiness. This would of course mean that the realms above the human realm, anti-God and God, are the aim of a life of devotion to being as human as one can, by way of choice to be spiritual. Spirituality begins at the human realm and ends at the animal. We can choose to use the gift of the ability to be spiritually inclined or neglect it and ultimately lose the choice itself. The deceased, while in the Bardo, has an accelerated impact on their personal karma, an opportunity to steer toward higher realms or lower, but it's not totally free of the karma accumulated while in the material body. The intricate details of deities, lights, and colors explained by the Tibetan Buddhists are subject matter that far exceeds the scope of what I want this podcast to be. But I encourage you to explore and study these subjects on your own. You don't have to become a devout Buddhist, or maybe you want to after listening to this, but knowing that clinical boundaries that limit our concepts about death are just that, boundaries and limits. I, for one, don't like to let limits and boundaries dictate my ideas of the afterlife. We need to use our ability to choose before the choice is lost altogether. While the Bardo is a period where a deceased person makes important choices and needs to flex their muscles of discernment, so is this earthly life. One is concerned with subtle energy, the latter with gross energies. But the distinction between them ends there. They both involve choice, conviction, and wisdom to navigate and withstand the obstacles which lie ahead. Now you could see why life on earth is merely a preparation for the journey through death, and why the Tibetan Buddhists are so vehemently honor their religious practices.